Clement rode into town with a feeling like a stone in his gut. It was a feeling he'd known for 4 years, ever since his wife Eleanor had been buried under a sky the color of old dust. He rode his sorrel mare, Patience, a good horse that had seen him through more than her fair share of lonely miles. The sun, high and sharp, turned the dust of the main street into a blinding haze. He adjusted the brim of his hat, the leather soft and worn, and saw the familiar faces of his neighbors turn away, not out of malice, but from a kind of weary politeness. They knew his silence, and they knew his ache. The general store was a patch of deep shadow and cool air. He tied Patience to the rail. The wood splintered and gray. The bell on the door jangled once, a sound like broken glass. Inside, the store smelled of dry goods and pipe tobacco. Clement nodded to old Mr. Gable, who was counting out nails into a canvas bag. "Clement," Gable said, his voice a low rumble. "Out of flour again?" "And lamp oil," Clement said. His voice felt rusty, unused. He held out his list, his handwriting a careful scrawl. Gable took the list, his eyes lingering for a moment on the empty space at the bottom, where Eleanor used to write in things like a length of lace or a pound of sugar candy. Clement turned away, his gaze falling on a stack of bolts of cheap calico. Eleanor had a dress made of that same material, a simple blue, now hanging in his wardrobe, smelling faintly of lavender and regret. The store felt too full, too loud. He wanted the quiet solitude of his ranch, the kind he used to crave, but now found a heavy, burdensome thing. The quiet of the homestead was a different kind of loneliness than the quiet of town, a quiet that had settled into the wood of his cabin, the dirt of his fields. The children were in the back corner, near the cracker barrel, huddled together like 3 lost birds in a windstorm. He hadn't noticed them at first, but their presence was a low hum in the back of the store. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, with a shock of black hair that fell across his eyes. A girl, a year or 2 younger, with a face so pale it looked like bone. And a third, a small child, maybe 6, clinging to the boy's trousers, his face hidden. They were dressed in clothes too large and too worn, rags really. The other townsfolk gave them a wide berth, a look in their eyes that was part pity and part something else, a superstition that clung to them like the dust of the street. Clement heard a low murmur from the men gathered near the wood stove. "Bad luck," one said, his voice a low growl. "Ever since they showed up, the rain stopped and the cattle got sick." Another man, a farmer named Silas, spat on the floor. "The whole lot of them. The parents were no good, and the kids are worse." Clement felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He knew that kind of talk. He'd heard it about Eleanor's family, a whisper campaign that had followed them from their last town. He'd never paid it mind then, and he wouldn't now. He walked toward the back of the store, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. The boy saw him coming and pulled his smaller child closer, a defensive gesture that squeezed Clement's heart. The girl watched him with large, solemn eyes that held no fear, only a deep, weary understanding. Her gaze felt older than her years. Clement stopped a respectful distance away, his hands in his pockets. He saw the way the boy's knuckles were white as he clutched the younger child. "You the orphans from the homestead up on Miller's Ridge?" Clement asked, his voice low and even. The boy nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. "Name's Jeremiah," he said, his voice thin but steady. "This here's Sarah, and that's Thomas." He gestured to the 2 children, a sense of fierce protective ownership in his tone. Clement nodded, his eyes on the smallest child, who still hid his face. "You hungry?" Clement asked. It was a simple question, a common courtesy. But the boy's eyes went wide. Sarah's stomach gave a loud, embarrassing rumble. Clement pulled a sack of molasses cookies from the bag Mr. Gable had given him and offered it to them. Jeremiah hesitated. But Sarah reached out a thin hand and took one, her small fingers trembling. She broke it in half, giving one piece to her brother. The boy, Thomas, still wouldn't look at him, but he took the cookie. He held it in his hand, looking at it like it was a gold coin. Clement felt the familiar stone in his gut shift, not away, but into a different kind of ache. He saw himself in their eyes, the loneliness, the hunger. It wasn't just for food, but for something else, something he couldn't name, but he knew as well as he knew his own name. He thought of his cabin, the way the fire sputtered in the hearth, the way the kettle whistled with a sound like a ghost sigh. He thought of the empty chair at his kitchen table, the way the dust gathered on the mantelpiece where Eleanor's small porcelain figurine of a bird used to sit. The house was too quiet, the work too easy, the days too long. The world had gone from being a vibrant, noisy place to a place of heavy, suffocating silence. He had a deep sense of not just want, but of need. He needed something to fill the quiet, something to break the still, gray light that came through his windows each morning. The preacher, a man with a stern face and a gentleness in his eyes that only came out when he was talking about children, came over. "Clement," he said, "you've heard the talk, I'm sure." Clement nodded, not looking at him. "It's a terrible thing," the preacher continued, his voice low. "They're good children. No one wants them. Folks are superstitious. They're going to be sent to the orphanage in Denver next week. Unless—" He trailed off, his gaze landing on the small, huddled forms of the children. Clement knew what the unspoken words were. He felt the weight of them. He could be the one to save them, to give them a home, but it would be a choice that would brand him. It would be a choice that would bring the same kind of judgment and suspicion that had followed him and Eleanor. He looked at the three of them again. Jeremiah with his quiet strength, Sarah with her eyes that held the wisdom of an old woman, and little Thomas, a ghost of a child who clung to his brother. He thought of the fields he'd plowed, the fences he'd mended, the cabin he'd built with his own two hands. It was a good home, a strong home, but it was an empty home. The silence was a physical presence, a thing that sat with him at the dinner table and slept at the foot of his bed. He thought of Eleanor's laugh. A sound like chimes in the wind, a sound he hadn't heard in years. He thought of how she would have looked at these children, her eyes filled with the tenderness that could melt the hardest man's heart. He felt a sharp, aching pang of a what-if, a longing for a life that could have been, a life full of the noise and chaos of children. He looked at the preacher. "How much?" he asked. The preacher blinked, surprised. "Clement, you can't. This isn't about money. It's about a home, a future." Clement held up a hand. "I know what it's about. How much for their passage to Denver? The papers? The whole lot of it." The preacher named a sum. It was not a small amount, not for a man who made his living from the dirt, but it was a price Clement was willing to pay. He looked at Jeremiah, who was watching him with a strange mix of suspicion and hope. "You come with me," Clement said to the boy, his voice low. "We're going to talk to Mr. Gable." Jeremiah nodded, his eyes never leaving Clement's face. He pulled the other two children to their feet, and they followed him, small, silent shadows. At the counter, Clement counted out the money, the coins heavy and cool in his palm. Mr. Gable watched him, his face unreadable. The townsfolk whispered. "He's a fool," one man said. "He's asking for more trouble than he can handle." Clement ignored them, his focus on the three children who stood behind him, their small bodies a wall of trembling uncertainty. He looked at them, and he felt a quiet, unfamiliar sense of purpose settle over him. It wasn't the same purpose he'd had when he'd been building his homestead, or when he'd been plowing his fields. This was a deeper purpose, a more human one. He felt a sudden, unexpected lightness in his chest, as if the stone in his gut had finally moved, if only a little. He paid the preacher, the finality of the transaction a sharp, sweet jolt. The preacher handed him a sheaf of papers, the ink still wet. "God bless you, Clement," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Clement just nodded, his gaze on the children. He had no grand words for them, no promises of a better life. He simply turned to them and said, "My cabin's about a 2-hour ride from here. Best get moving before the sun goes down." Jeremiah, Sarah, and Thomas looked at each other, and then back at Clement. They were 3 small people in a world that had not been kind to them, and they were looking at him as if he were a mirage, a trick of the light. Clement waited. He saw the shift in Jeremiah's eyes, the moment he decided to trust, to take the risk. He saw the trust mirrored in Sarah's face. Little Thomas, still half hidden, gave a tiny nod, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. Clement felt a quiet breath leave his lungs, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned and walked out of the store, the 3 of them following him, their small steps a soft rhythm behind his own. The dusty street, which had seemed so loud and chaotic just moments before, now felt hushed, a stage for a quiet, unfolding story. He untied Patience and helped Sarah onto the saddle. Then he lifted Thomas up and set him in front of her. Jeremiah walked alongside them, his hand resting on the mare's flank. They were a strange procession, a silent caravan of 3 lost souls and 1 lonely man. As they rode out of town, leaving the whispers behind, Clement felt a quiet certainty settle over him. He knew this was a good choice, a right choice. And for the first time in 4 years, the stone in his gut felt less like a heavy weight, and more like the first, firm root of a new and unexpected life. The journey to Clement's homestead was a quiet one. The late afternoon sun cast long, thin shadows that stretched and shrank as they moved across the open land. Sarah, a small, fragile-looking thing, held a firm grip on the saddle horn, her knuckles white. Thomas, nestled in front of her, was a still, silent bundle, his head resting against her shoulder. Jeremiah, walking beside Patience, moved with a quiet, tireless energy, his eyes scanning the horizon, a boy playing a man's role. Clement rode with his gaze fixed ahead, but his mind was a tangle of old memories and new anxieties. He was a man of routines, of predictable seasons and work. This was a wild, unknown variable he had just willingly introduced into his life. He thought of his wife's face, her kind smile, the way she used to hum to herself while she worked in the garden. He wondered what she would have thought of this. He hoped she would have approved. The cabin appeared as a smudge of gray against the rising hills, the last rays of sunlight turning its windows into fiery squares. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, a leftover from the fire he'd had burning that morning. As they got closer, the familiar silhouette of his barn and the crooked fence of his corral came into view. The air was cool and smelled of dry grass and the promise of rain. Clement dismounted and helped Sarah and Thomas down. The 2 children stood on the hard-packed dirt, looking at the cabin as if it were a foreign monument. Jeremiah stayed by the mare, his hand still on her flank, a silent farewell to the only thing he had touched in hours. "This is it," Clement said, his voice flat. He wasn't sure what else to say. The cabin felt too small, too quiet to hold the weight of so many new lives. Inside, the cabin was a place of deep shadows and hushed light. He lit a lantern, its soft glow illuminating the worn wooden table, the 2 chairs, the small cooking stove. The air smelled of old ash and stale air. He watched the children as they took it all in. Jeremiah's eyes were assessing, taking stock of the space with a quick, practiced eye. Sarah's gaze was drawn to a small, hand-carved bird that sat on the mantelpiece, a gift from Clement's father. Little Thomas still clung to his brother's leg, his face buried in the faded wool of Jeremiah's trousers. "There's a pot of stew on the stove," Clement said, his voice a little louder than he'd intended. "From this morning. It's probably cold." He didn't bother to ask if they were hungry. He knew the answer. He stoked the fire, its hungry crackle filling the silence. The stew pot, a heavy black thing, warmed on the flames, and soon the cabin was filled with the rich, earthy smell of potatoes and rabbit. He set out 3 chipped bowls and 3 spoons, a sight that felt both foreign and deeply right. He watched them eat, the way they held their spoons, the way they ate slowly at first, then with a desperate, quiet hunger. They ate without speaking, their focus entirely on the food. Clement sat across from them, nursing a mug of black coffee, the steam warming his hands. He watched the lamplight fall on their faces, on the smudges of dirt and the thinness of their cheeks. He saw a shared history in the way they moved, and the way they glanced at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. After they had eaten, Clement washed the dishes while they sat at the table, their small bodies, a quiet presence in his once empty home. He set out 3 blankets and gestured to the floor near the hearth. "It's the warmest place," he said. "You'll be comfortable enough." Jeremiah and Sarah nodded, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. They spread the blankets out on the floor, their movements precise and economical, a choreography born of long practice. Little Thomas finally looked at Clement, his eyes wide and dark in the flickering light, before he was folded into the blankets by his siblings. Clement went to his own bed, the empty side of it a cold, familiar thing. He listened to the soft sounds of their breathing, the crackle of the fire, the wind whispering around the eaves. It was a different kind of quiet now, a new sound, and he found he could not sleep for the listening of it. The first week was a study in quietness. The children were like field mice, moving through the cabin and the yard with a silent, watchful grace. Jeremiah helped with the chores. He was strong for his age, and he seemed to know instinctively how to mend a fence, how to feed the chickens, how to saddle a horse. He worked with a quiet intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. He never spoke unless spoken to, and then his answers were brief and to the point. He was a boy who had learned to make himself small, a lesson Clement understood deeply. Sarah, too, was a worker. She helped him in the kitchen, her small hands quick and deft with a paring knife. She seemed to be a creature of order, of cleaning and sweeping. She would hum a tuneless little song to herself as she worked, a sound that brought a strange ache to Clement's chest. Little Thomas was the most difficult to figure out. He still clung to Jeremiah, a silent shadow. He didn't speak, not a single word. He watched Clement with large, unblinking eyes, as if waiting for a trap to be sprung. One morning, Clement was working in the barn, mending a bridle, the scent of hay and horse leather filling the air. Jeremiah was with him, oiling a stubborn hinge on the barn door. Clement glanced up and saw Sarah and Thomas playing near the well. Sarah was holding a small, smooth rock, and she was talking to it as if it were a doll. Little Thomas was watching her, his head tilted. Suddenly, a sound rang out. It was a sharp, high-pitched scream from Sarah. Clement and Jeremiah both dropped what they were doing and ran. Sarah was on her knees, her hands covering her face, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. Little Thomas stood over her, his small fist balled at his sides, his face a mask of silent fury. "What is it?" Clement asked, his heart thudding in his chest. Sarah dropped her hands and pointed to the ground. There, lying on the dirt, was the porcelain bird from Clement's mantelpiece, shattered into 100 tiny pieces. Jeremiah stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock and guilt. Little Thomas had found his voice in a scream of pure rage. "He broke it," Sarah sobbed, pointing at Thomas. Clement felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. It was the anger of something broken that could not be fixed. The bird had been Eleanor's, a gift from her mother. It was the last thing he had of her, a fragile piece of her memory that had somehow survived the years. And now, it was gone. He looked from Sarah's tear-stained face to Jeremiah's silent shame, and finally to Thomas, who stood with his small shoulders hunched, his eyes dark with a defiance that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. This was the complication, this was the trouble. It had come, quiet and sudden as a cloud, and now it stood between them all. He felt the old ache, the old loneliness return. He had brought them here to fill the emptiness, but now the emptiness felt even more profound, made more so by this new, sharp kind of pain. He looked at the shattered pieces of porcelain, at the beautiful little bird that would never be whole again. He looked at the three children, and he felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. He didn't know how to fix this, how to make them whole again, or how to make himself whole in their presence. He felt the need to get to the bottom of it, but he knew that lashing out would only serve to further break the tentative trust they had built. He knew that in this moment, a choice, a moral choice, was required of him. He needed to find a way to navigate this without destroying what little they had. He looked at the pieces of the broken bird and felt the quiet terror of a man who had chosen to be responsible for something he didn't know how to fix. Clement stood over the shattered pieces of porcelain, a strange stillness settling over him. The anger, sharp and hot a moment ago, receded, replaced by a deep, tired resignation. He knelt, his knees cracking, and began to pick up the slivers of the bird. The pieces were smooth and cool, a beautiful, impossible puzzle. The children watched him, silent now, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. Jeremiah's eyes were still wide with shock. Sarah had stopped crying, but her shoulders still trembled. Thomas, the smallest of them all, had retreated behind Jeremiah, his small body pressed against his brother's back. Clement worked slowly, methodically, his hands careful. He placed the pieces in his hat, the felt a dark backdrop for the brilliant white fragments. When he was done, he stood, the hat in his hands, and looked at the children. "Who broke it?" he asked. His voice was low and even, devoid of any anger. He looked directly at Thomas. The boy didn't flinch. Jeremiah stepped forward, his small chin lifted. "I did," he said, his voice flat. "I'm sorry, Mr. Clement. I was playing with him, and I wasn't careful." Clement looked at Jeremiah, at the defiance in his eyes, at the way his body was tense, ready for the punishment. He knew the boy was lying. He saw the way Jeremiah's gaze flickered to his younger brother, a silent promise, a fierce shield. Clement looked back at Thomas, who still hid, but whose small hand was now wrapped around Jeremiah's trousers, a silent, desperate grip. Clement knew what this was. This was the instinct of family, the self-sacrifice, the protective lie. He felt a different kind of pain now, a sharp understanding of the weight of Jeremiah's lie. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He did not call Jeremiah out. Instead, he looked at Thomas and said, "Well, we'll see about fixing it. Come with me." He turned and walked to the cabin, the children following him like a shadow. Inside, he lit another lantern and went to a small trunk he kept under his bed. He pulled out a box filled with his father's old tools, tiny chisels, delicate files, and a small, smooth bottle of resin. He had used these tools to mend a broken stirrup, to fix a stubborn hinge on a box, but he had never tried to put something so delicate back together. He sat at the kitchen table and emptied the contents of his hat onto the worn wood. The pieces of the bird lay scattered like fallen snow. The children stood at a respectful distance, watching him with a quiet, breathless curiosity. He took a small piece of wood, a splinter from an old fence post, and a tiny piece of the broken bird. He applied a small bead of the resin to the wood. Then he held the porcelain piece to it, his large, callous fingers steady and precise. He worked slowly, painstakingly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not speak. The children did not speak. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the fire and the low, rhythmic whisper of his breathing. Hours passed. The moon rose, a pale white coin in the window. The children, one by one, drifted to the hearth, falling asleep under their blankets, but Clement continued to work. He worked until his back ached and his eyes stung. He worked until the first faint light of dawn came through the window, painting the darkness with gray. By the time the sun was fully up, he was done. The bird was not perfect. It was a mosaic of a thing, its white porcelain crisscrossed with thin, dark lines where the resin had sealed the cracks. The shape was there, the dignity was there, but the smooth, flawless surface was gone forever. It was a scarred bird, a bird that had been broken and put back together. He left it on the table to dry and went out to milk the cow, the familiar chill of the morning air a balm on his tired skin. When he came back, the children were awake. They were gathered around the table, staring at the bird. Sarah reached out a finger and traced one of the dark lines. She looked at Clement, her eyes wide with a new kind of wonder. Later that day, Clement was mending a fence near the north pasture. He was a man who worked with his hands, and the rhythm of the work, the swing of the hammer, the tension of the wire, was a comfort. Jeremiah came to help him, a silent, willing shadow. They worked side by side, a comfortable silence passing between them. After a while, Jeremiah stopped working and looked at Clement. "Why'd you fix it?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. "It was broken. It was just a little bird." Clement looked at him, his hammer resting on the top rail of the fence. "Some things are worth fixing," he said. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Jeremiah nodded, a flicker of something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, of earned trust. That night, Clement sat at the kitchen table, the silence in the cabin a different kind of quiet than it had been before. It was a quiet that was full of the sound of 3 children breathing softly in their sleep. He lit a candle and looked at the bird. The dark lines of the resin were like veins, a road map of its own history. He saw the beauty in the imperfection, the strength in the mending. He realized that this was not just a broken object, but a lesson. He had taken something that had been shattered and put it back together, and in doing so, he had somehow, quietly, begun to do the same to himself. He had opened his home to 3 broken children, 3 shattered lives, and in the process, he had found a kind of mending for his own. He picked up the bird, its weight solid in his hand, and he placed it back on the mantelpiece, a testament to the idea that some things are not just worth saving, but worth the slow, painstaking work of being made whole again. He looked at it, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a quiet tenderness bloom in his chest, a feeling like the soft glow of the lantern. It was a feeling of not just want, but of being needed. He blew out the candle and went to bed, the quiet in the cabin no longer a burden, but a gentle, warm presence. A home not just for him, but for all of them. One afternoon, a few weeks later, a storm rolled in, a black fist of a thing that came down with a roar of wind and a lashing of rain. The cabin, which had always felt so solid, now felt like a small boat in a wild sea. Inside, the fire was a hungry, dancing thing. The children were huddled together on the floor, listening to the wind howl around the eaves. Clement was mending a pair of worn boots. Suddenly, a new sound came from outside, a sharp, metallic clang. Clement looked up, his brow furrowed. "The shutters," he muttered. "The wind must have torn one loose." He got up, pulling on his oilskin coat. "Stay here," he told the children. "I'll be right back." He went outside into the maelstrom. The wind was a solid wall, pushing against him, trying to knock him down. The rain was a cold, blinding assault. He made his way to the side of the cabin, and there, the shutter, half torn from its hinges, was banging back and forth against the wall with a sound like a hammer. He grabbed it, his hands slipping on the wet wood, and tried to fasten it back in place, but the wind was too strong. A sudden gust tore it from his grasp and sent it crashing to the ground with a splintering thud. He stood there for a moment, defeated, his head bowed against the wind and the rain. Then a new sound cut through the noise of the storm. It was the sound of a voice. "Mr. Clement." He looked up and saw them. All 3 of them, Jeremiah, Sarah and Thomas, standing under the small overhang of the porch, looking at him with wide, concerned eyes. Jeremiah was holding a hammer. Sarah was holding a handful of nails. Little Thomas was holding a coil of rope. They were soaked, their clothes plastered to their small bodies, but they were there. They hadn't stayed inside, and they hadn't run away. They had come to help. Clement felt a sudden, unexpected lump form in his throat. He felt the cold rain on his face, but he felt a warmth deep inside his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He looked at the three of them, and he saw not just 3 children, but a crew, a family. He pointed to the top of the cabin. "You can get that old pulley," he yelled over the wind. "We can hoist a rope and get it tied down." Jeremiah nodded, a look of quiet competence on his face. He and Sarah went to work, and Clement, with the help of little Thomas, managed to secure the rope. In the end, they were a team. They didn't speak much, but their movements were a silent conversation, a practiced dance of trust and mutual obligation. They fixed the shutter, and they went inside, dripping and exhausted, but a little taller. That night, Clement sat by the fire, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He watched the children who had fallen asleep, their bodies a warm, tangled mess of blankets on the floor. He watched the firelight dance across their faces, and he thought of the storm. He thought of the wind and the rain and the broken shutter. He thought of how he had felt defeated, and then he thought of how they had appeared. He thought of the 3 of them, a small, wet army, ready to fight the storm with him. And he realized that they had brought more to his life than just quietness. They had brought something of an unexpected value, something that had been hidden from everyone else. He thought of the talk, the whispers of bad luck, the superstition that had surrounded them. And he smiled, a small, private thing, because he knew now that what the world had called bad luck was in fact a kind of treasure. It was a treasure of the heart, a fortune in the form of quiet competence, a fierce loyalty, and a love that had to be earned, a quiet tenderness that had been hiding in plain sight. It was a fortune that had been waiting for a lonely man to buy it, and for a good storm to prove its worth. A month passed, then 2. The seasons turned, the leaves on the cottonwood trees changing from a vibrant green to a shimmering gold. The days were filled with the rhythm of work and the quiet hum of a full house. Clement found himself humming as he worked, a tuneless, soft sound that echoed the small, quiet melodies Sarah would hum as she swept the floor. Jeremiah, who had been a silent shadow, began to speak more, his voice a low rumble. He would ask questions about the crops, about the weather, about the best way to mend a broken fence. Little Thomas still rarely spoke, but he began to follow Clement like a small, silent dog, his hand finding Clement's and holding on with a trusting grip. He would stand at Clement's side in the barn, watching as he mended a saddle or fed the horses, his small face filled with a quiet contentment. One afternoon, as the first cold bite of winter was in the air, Clement was putting up a new section of fence in the south pasture. He was a long way from the cabin, and the work was hard. He sank the last post into the frozen ground, his breath coming out in white puffs. As he turned to hammer the first rail into place, his boot caught on a raised root, and he went down hard, his ankle twisting underneath him. A sharp, blinding pain shot up his leg. He cried out, a guttural sound of surprise and pain, and then he lay there, his jaw clenched against the pain. He tried to get up, but the moment he put weight on his leg, a fresh wave of agony washed over him. He was stuck. He was a long way from the cabin, and no one knew where he was. The sun was low in the sky, a watery, pale disk, and the air was getting colder by the minute. He felt the old, familiar feeling of loneliness, a cold, hard knot of fear in his gut. He was there for what felt like an eternity. The pain, a constant, throbbing presence. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, a sound reached his ears. It was the sound of voices, small and far away. He raised his head and saw them, all three of them, Jeremiah, Sarah, and Thomas, walking toward him, their silhouettes stark against the gathering twilight. They had come looking for him. Jeremiah was holding a lantern, its soft glow a beacon in the dusk. Sarah had a canteen of water. Little Thomas, who had never spoken a word, had a small, thin blanket clutched in his hands. They reached him, their faces pale with worry. Jeremiah knelt at his side, his young face a mask of concern. "We saw you weren't back," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "We came to find you." Clement looked at them, at their small, determined faces, and the fear in his gut receded, replaced by a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had not just come to help, they had come to save him. He had bought them, but they had paid him back in a currency far more valuable than any coin. They had brought a fortune of loyalty and love to his life, a treasure that had been waiting for a lonely man to find it. They helped him up, their small bodies a solid support, and they walked him back to the cabin, the light of the lantern dancing ahead of them. The pain in his leg was a dull ache now, a small, tolerable discomfort compared to the warmth in his heart. He looked at them, at the three small people who had filled his empty home and his empty life. He thought of the world's whispers, the talk of bad luck. He smiled. The world he knew now had been blind. It had seen three abandoned children and called them a burden, but he had seen something more. He had seen a chance at a new kind of life, a chance to mend not just a broken bird, but a broken heart. He had bought 3 orphans, and in return, they had brought him a fortune. It was a kind of luck he wouldn't trade for all the gold in California. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story of found family, you can find the complete series and many others just like it on this channel. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single story.